This is new video of the drama unfolding in Baghdad today. That's the U.S. Embassy surrounded by massive clouds of smoke. Hundreds of Iraqi protesters stormed the building this morning. They managed to make their way inside while U.S. troops were still present. The demonstration follows a series of American airstrikes in Iraq and Syria targeting an Iranian-backed militia group. Jacqueline Hansen is in Washington tracking the very latest on this. So what more can you tell us about what is going on right now in Baghdad?
Well, Jennifer, it's turned into a violent scene there. We're now hearing reports of injuries among the demonstrators there in Baghdad outside the U.S. Embassy. And that new video, it really shows what's been happening there. Just crowds of mostly men, Iraqi supporters of an Iran-backed militia who are demonstrating outside the U.S. Embassy. And if you take a look at the video, you can see the wall around the compound. They're sort of challenging that wall by throwing rocks over it. They've been lighting branches and throwing those branches over the wall. You mentioned that there's reports that they were able to breach the compound and get inside the embassy, though I've actually seen some conflicting reports on that as well. So a bit unclear still at this point. It's also unclear how many people might still be in that building. But it is important to note, well, actually, just on those injuries, the medical sources saying now that 12 people who were in that crowd have been injured. And that's because the embassy guards have been trying to push back protesters using tear gas as well as stun grenades. So reports now of about 12 injuries. But important to note that these are not the only protests going on in Iraq right now. For months, there have been protests in the streets that were anti-government demonstrations. The one at this embassy is in support, as I mentioned, of this Iran-backed militia. So completely different protests. These protesters are angry over airstrikes by the U.S. that were carried out on Sunday, and those strikes killed about 25 fighters and wounded dozens more. Now, the U.S. says that attack was in retaliation because of another attack at an Iraqi military base, which killed an American civilian contractor. But we'll keep monitoring any of that new video coming in, Jennifer.
And I know also there in Washington, you are tracking the response to this breaking news. What are you hearing?
Well, the U.S. president is blaming Iran for this attack on the U.S. embassy in Iraq, and he's calling on Iraq to help protect the compound. So take a look at this tweet from the president. He says, "Iran killed an American contractor, wounding many. We strongly responded and always will. Now Iran is orchestrating an attack on the U.S. embassy in Iraq. They will be held fully responsible. In addition, we expect Iraq to use its forces to protect the embassy, and so notified." And we've also just learned that there is a State Department briefing expected today, so we'll likely hear more on this afternoon and maybe get some more information on where the U.S. ambassador actually is. You know, we also heard from Iraq's prime minister earlier this morning. He has called the U.S. airstrikes unacceptable, vicious assault that will have dangerous consequences. But today he said he asked protesters to stay away from the embassy compounds. He says aggression will be prevented and punished by law. So, Jennifer, at least some attempt there to try to calm this quite heated situation.
Jacqueline Hansen in Washington, thank you for this.
The situation at the U.S. Embassy in Iraq appears to be improving. Protests flared up earlier today on the heels of an attack on a compound yesterday. Demonstrators had gathered in response to Sunday's U.S. airstrikes against Iraqi militia fighters backed by Iran. Alana Petrov is tracking this story from our London bureau. So, Alana, what's the latest?
Hannah, this morning it was looking like the protests outside the U.S. Embassy in Baghdad could go on for weeks, maybe even months. Demonstrators at the scene were saying they wouldn't leave until the U.S. military got out of the country. And they had food, supplies, even tents for camping out. They were angry about targeted American military strikes on Sunday that killed at least 25 people. But then we heard that groups leading the protests were telling their supporters they could clear out. The Iraqi government was asking them to leave, and the crowds listened. Now, many moved to a nearby location, so they didn't leave entirely. Some people ignored the instructions and stayed in place. But this is an unexpected turn of events, and it's a welcome development. It now looks like the situation, which escalated quickly yesterday, could be calming down.
So, Alana, this is a difficult situation, as you're telling people, and it's hard to understand for people who don't follow regularly. We know Donald Trump is blaming Iran for these protests, even though they're taking part in Iraq. Can you break that down for us?
Okay, so we all know that the U.S. and Iran don't get along. The U.S. has very strong economic sanctions on Iran that have really squeezed the country. And so there are many cases where Iran fights back. These protests that were happening yesterday and this morning, they're seen as part of a larger showdown between the U.S. and Iran. And these fights play out across the Middle East in different ways. So Iran is backing these protesters and helping to coordinate the demonstrations. Both the U.S. and Iran have a lot of clout within Iraq. Donald Trump also called out Iran for these protests in a tweet yesterday. Let's take a look at what he had to say. He specifically said in this tweet, Iran will be held fully responsible for lives lost or damage incurred at any of our facilities. They will pay a very big price. This is not a warning, it is a threat. Happy New Year. So, even though the protesters are dispersing in Baghdad, the situation remains tense, specifically between the two rivals, Iran on the one hand and the U.S. on the other hand.
Alana, thanks for breaking that down for us. That's the CBC's Alana Petrov in London.